Welcome to Your Week with St. Luke's, a weekly podcast from St. Luke's United Methodist Church in Orlando that invites you to go deeper with Scripture, to learn God's story, so that together we can live, love, and lead a life following Jesus to awaken disciples and reveal the kingdom. This week on Your Week with St. Luke's, we are again led by Dr. Ryan Bonfigllio of the Candler Foundry. We're continuing in our series, Resolute in Purpose, which is inviting us all to become more confident in our values and how we lead our lives based on those values. This week, we are moving back to the beginning of the book of Daniel, where we'll get a little more backstory on why our friends Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego ended up in that fiery furnace to begin with. We'll be focused entirely on chapter 1, which will give us more of a specific view of Daniel's story, and then we'll continue his story through the end of this series. Now, this week we ask the question, where will it take me if I stay resolute in my values? We'll see all the places it takes Daniel as we begin at the beginning of his story in chapter 1. And as always, we hope you'll join us on Sunday in worship, but this week we'll be having a special guest preacher, Reverend Dr. Gary Mason, a longtime friend of St. Luke's, visiting us from Ireland. He'll be helping us take Daniel's story and using that as a lens for the times we find ourselves in and the callings that might be upon us as modern-day prophets. But for now, let's turn to Dr. Bonfigllio as we begin to look at the story of Daniel.
The story told in the book of Daniel is set during what is known as the Babylonian exile. This is a 40-plus year period in the middle of the 6th century BCE. It begins when the greatest superpower of that day, the Babylonians, invade southern Israel, they destroy Jerusalem, and they tear down the temple. What's more, the Babylonians take the best and brightest of the people, priests and scribes, rulers and sages, and they deport them to other parts of the empire. The idea here is that if you uproot conquered people, then their communities will be less able to organize a rebellion or resist in any fashion. In other words, in the ancient world, exile was a strategy of political oppression. And this is exactly what we see playing out in the first few verses of Daniel chapter 1. A Babylonian king named Nebuchadnezzar has brought into his court young men who are described in verse 4 as being without physical defect and handsome, versed in every branch of wisdom, endowed with knowledge and insight. These individuals were probably still teenagers, maybe 16 or 17 years old, and you might think of them as being the top high school students of the day, bound for the best colleges and universities. There were probably dozens, if not hundreds, of young men in this very position. But the book of Daniel focuses on only 4 of them: Daniel and his 3 friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Now, Nebuchadnezzar brings these 4 into his court in order to groom them to be high-ranking officials. Now, for this to happen, the king has to remake these young Israelites in the image of good Babylonian citizens. And he does this in 2 ways. First, he immediately has them educated in the literature and language of the Chaldeans, which is just another term for Babylonians. He wants them to speak Babylonian, to know its culture and its history, to be fluent in its traditions and customs. It's a form of re-education by which these men are forced to acquire the characteristics and norms of a new culture. Now, second, the king gives them new names. In verse 7 of chapter 1, we read that Daniel is to be called Belshazzar, and Hananiah is called Shadrach, Mishael is called Meshach, and Azariah is called Abednego. Now, you can think of this as something akin to what happened to many immigrants who entered the U.S. in the early 20th century. Take my own family. A branch of my family were called the Robertinos, but at Ellis Island, they were given the surname Roberts, which just sounded more American and less Italian. Similarly, my grandmother Florentina was renamed Florence. Then and now, renaming is a type of forced assimilation, a way of asking people to shed their foreign identity and to replace it with an identity that matches the majority culture. Now, there's something else going on here as well. You see, the original names of these four young men all reference the God of Israel. The L that you hear at the end of Daniel and Mishael is the Hebrew word for God. And the Ayah that you hear at the end of Hananiah and Azariah is the shortened form of God's personal name, Yahweh. Each through their names is marked by God. However, the new names they receive all make reference to Babylonian gods. You see, the Babylonian king isn't just trying to erase their ethnic heritage, he's trying to erase their religious identity. So, the picture that is beginning to emerge is one of forced assimilation. Every marker of their identity as followers of Yahweh is being slowly chipped away. Their homes are gone. Their language is replaced. Their customs and even their names are changed. What's interesting is up until this point, we have no indication that Daniel and his friends resisted in any way. There is no sign of protest. All of this changes in verse 8. There we learn that Daniel and his friends refused to eat the food and wine provided by the king for 10 straight days. And this is a remarkable thing. You see, if you've ever been a parent, you'll know that this is the first and last time in human history that teenage boys ever refused food. The question is, why? What was wrong with the food from the king's table? Interestingly, the text doesn't tell us. Now, maybe Daniel thought that the food was somehow unhealthy from a dietary perspective. Some recent interpreters have run wild with this possibility, coming up with what is known as the Daniel fast diet that emphasizes simplicity and plant-based nutrition. Google it. Or maybe the problem was that the king's food wasn't kosher, meaning that it included food that the book of Deuteronomy specified that Israel's shouldn't eat. Things like shellfish and pork. Now, this is possible, but keep in mind that nowhere in the Old Testament does it say that eating non-kosher food will defile you, as Daniel seems to be worried about here in chapter 1. I want to suggest a third possibility. Daniel and his friends refused the food as a way to publicly express their unique identity. This was something for all to see. This action marks them as a distinct people. It's a way of setting themselves apart. How they distinguish themselves is somewhat arbitrary. They could have just as easily chosen to only wear sandals on their left feet or to grow out mullets. The exact form of the distinction didn't matter. What mattered is that what they did was public and visible. Whatever the case might be, we have every reason to think that abstaining from the king's food will diminish the health of Daniel and his friends. But of course, the exact opposite occurs in the text. After 10 days, it turns out that Daniel and his friends look healthier and more vibrant than all of the other palace officials who ate from the king's table. What's more, Daniel and his friends proved to be wiser and more knowledgeable than even the greatest Babylonian thinkers. You see, they flourish physically and intellectually. The implied message, I think, is that Daniel and his friends are being nourished not by the king's table, but by the love and mercy of God. So, what do we make of this interesting first story in the book of Daniel? Let me offer two possible takeaways. First, at its core, Daniel 1 is a story about remembering who we are when we are away from home. I grew up in a relatively small town just outside of Philadelphia. It was a town where my dad was born, where he went to high school, and where he and my mom operated a small arts and crafts store that they started in the early 1970s. My dad was a relatively well-known figure around town, and while there were a lot of other Italian Americans in Lansdale, there weren't any other Bonfigglios. When we got into high school, my brother and I started to go out with friends, and my dad used to sit us down and he would lay out what he expected of us when we were away from home. Now, the interesting thing is, my dad didn't give us a list of black and white do's and don'ts. Instead, he simply said, remember, you're a Bonfigllio. Dad was trying to tell us two things. First, he was reminding us that if we ever did get into trouble, word would eventually get back to him. Remember, it was a really small town and my dad was well known. But second, and I think more importantly, my dad was reminding us that when we left the house, whatever pressures we faced, whatever our friends were doing, we were to remember who we were. We were to remember our values and our priorities. We were to act in a way consistent with our upbringing. Now, it doesn't hurt that in Italian, the name Bonfilio literally means good son. And so in calling us to remember that we were Bonfilios, Dad was reminding us to live into our identities, even when, and especially when, we were away from home. In many ways, Daniel 1 is also a story about living into one's identity away from home. Daniel and his friends were in a foreign place. They were learning new languages. They were being exposed to new customs and new ways of life and even new religions. None of this was bad per se, but in the midst of all of this, their challenge was to remember who they were and whose they were. Remember, their original names, Daniel, Mishael, Hananiah, and Azariah, linked them to God. So when they were given new names, they must find ways to live out their true identities, to act in a way that is consistent with who God had purposed them to be. This is a challenge each of us must take seriously. The great singer-songwriter Dolly Parton once said, "Find out who you are and then go do it on purpose." Remember that as children of God, you are loved, forgiven, accepted, and affirmed. Go be and do that on purpose. Second, I want to go back to Daniel's refusal to not eat from the king's table. This was a way in which he visibly and publicly marked himself as distinct. It was an outward expression of an inward reality. How would someone know that you were a follower of Jesus? What about you would stand out to a friend or neighbor, even if they didn't know you were involved at St. Luke's? Is it something you consistently do? Or maybe is it something you don't do? It is essential for each of us to answer this question. We, like Daniel and his friends, need to think about how we publicly express our faith. Yes, faith is a very personal thing, but it doesn't follow that faith is meant to be a private thing. Now, this doesn't mean we all have to be street corner preachers. In fact, I would recommend against it. But it does mean that we need to think of our public witness. How does our faith show up in a way that is visible and tangible to others? At the same time, we need to recognize that the book of Daniel does not provide us with a step-by-step guide on how to cultivate faith when you're away from home. Remember, Daniel and his friends would have been living in Babylonia long before they started to refuse to eat from the king's table. During that time, they would have faced pressure to assimilate on several fronts: their language, their customs, even their names. And there's no indication that they resisted any of this. They seem to be fine blending in until they're not. What changed? What did they refuse to eat? Why did they refuse to eat from the king's table while accepting other customs and practices in the king's court? Were there other Israelites who chose to distinguish themselves in different ways? Probably so. Did they have other friends who were fine eating the king's food and wine, but maybe refused to speak Babylonian? Perhaps. We simply don't know. The text, though, invites us to wonder about when it is appropriate to play the long game and blend in, and when we must draw the line, stand up and speak out for what we believe. We are left to ask ourselves, what are the risks involved in both approaches? And where can we find sources of resilience and hope along the way? These are some of the questions that we'll be paying attention to in the upcoming weeks. And I hope that what we have begun to explore here will help you live out your faith identity in a way that is authentic to who you are.